Entity Framework. What is Entity Framework? It's a way of writing C# code to produce an SQL table or an SQL database which contains that table. More specifically, if we have a C# class and we can use that class to produce an SQL table within a database. We have here properties of the class, for example the ID, which will translate into the ID column of the SQL table. The person property of this class will transfer into the person column, and same with the balance will be converted into a balance heading or column name. So let's start off and produce a Visual Studio project. We can create a new project and we can make it a console application. So we'll add a class to our project. Make sure we click on the project and not the solution, and then add a class, and we'll call the class student. So let me modify the student class to contain some properties. As I mentioned before, we have a property here, an ID property, and we have a string property for the person's name, and then the age, which will make an integer, and this will produce ultimately a corresponding SQL table. Now, I previously mentioned that we used a C# class to produce an SQL table, but what about producing the database itself? Well, to do that we have what we call a context, and here's the context which will produce this database schema or database structure, which will contain our particular table. So let's therefore introduce a context class. And you'll notice it's derived from DB context, which is inherit from that, which is the class which represents contexts in general. And our particular context, which is called my DB context, is going to represent the database itself. In other words, it's going to communicate with the database. So the student class will produce a table within this database, and you'll notice that I've got I'm going to have a DB set of a student. In other words, that's telling us that it's going to produce that particular table within that database. We've only got one table at the moment, which is our student table, but we would have many of these if we had many tables. So far we've just got an ordinary console application, and we're going to now introduce Entity Framework. And to do that we should take note of these names here, or roughly, because we're going to do a browse and look for them. SQL Server, that's because we're using SQL Server and we're not using SQLite, for example. So let's try to install these using NuGet, but keep an eye on those names there, because I'm going to need to browse to them. So to do that, I'm going to go to my tools and then NuGet Package Manager, and the package manage solution. Right, now, so I need to remember I was looking for the SQL server, so let me just see if this will find it for me or not. That's the one there, so I can check that, and I should be able to therefore install that package. And the other one that we will be using is the when that installs is accept notice it's come up picking up that error now, and I'll come back to that. Let me just install the other package as well, which is tools NuGet, and I could do a browse for the tools. EntityFrameWork Core tools I'm looking for, that's it there, and I can install that as well. So let me go back and see what that error is about. Well, before I go any further, I think I'll put this class into its own class, which I should have done in the first place really. So let me just add another class to that. And indeed I will call it the same name. So it's my DB context. And let me take that code from students, and cut that and paste it into and I've now separated the classes. So that's still showing an error, so let's see if I can remedy that. If I click on it, and then I can carefully click on the first suggestion, which is using EntityFrameWork Core. Now you'll notice that that's appeared up here now, which is rather convenient, so you don't have to remember which one corresponds. So just to summarize what we've got now, we've got two classes. Well, we've got three in total, but we've got the two classes. This class here, the student, is going to produce a table, and this one here, the context, is going to produce the database itself. So just to summarize, we've got our two classes, our program and student, and the third class, of course, being the context. So that represents the database, that represents the student class we're going to make a table from, and the program that runs the program. We could just take a little look at that. It says hello world at the moment. That won't bother us, but we could delete that eventually. We could just run it if you like to check that it does actually produce hello world. But notice here we've also got our libraries, our entity framework libraries, which we're going to use these libraries to produce the database. And you'll notice that they've been under the packages, and we've also introduced net core as well. Okay, so how do we instruct C# to use my two classes to produce the corresponding tables? And the answer is, by the way, I'll just save all of my files there. And the way to make that conversion is to use NuGet again. We go to Tools, NuGet, Package Manager, but this time we choose the console. From here we need to instruct it to produce the database and the table. So the way we do that is and the command that we use is to add migration. What is a migration? A migration is the code which will convert it from SQL, from C# into our table. Now, migration, you might think it has another meaning, but in this case it just means to produce the database. So we'll call it whatever you like to call the migration. It doesn't matter what you call it, because we'll be using them every time we change the database structure. We need to run another migration, so you'll be running these all the time, so the name is not actually really important. We need to run this every time we change the structure of the database. We need to run a migration, and the migration will have a different name each time. So hopefully we don't have any errors in our code, and it will give us indeed. Well, indeed we do have some errors, so let's take a look. Well, that's a bit silly. I've left out the specification for the particular database that we're going to be using, so this we need to include our connection string here, and we're specifying our SQL database, and the name of the database is going to be called test. I might just change that to distinguish from any other databases that we might have on the server. And by the way, a nice instruction here is to clear so that we can get a fresh start. And by the way, if we use an up arrow, which I'm doing now, and then run my migration again, well, that's failed again. But I can see why, because we've got an extra an extra brace down here. So let me just get rid of that. I think that's a good exercise, that the build will fail using NuGet if there's a source code error. So let me try, I'll save everything and then run again. I'll do an up arrow, and you see I've called it after many attempts. You can just keep calling it a different name, the migration that is. So if I press enter and run that migration, then that seems to have worked. Now let's take a look and see what that's actually done. Well, let's take a look at Solution Explorer, and you'll see it's introduced in a folder with the migrations code here. We've got both of those migrations, which are, if you take a look at them, they're instructions for how to build the table, along with the properties being converted into columns and the primary key field, for example, which is the ID, and so on. So you could just take a look at those, but for the moment we now need to go back to our NuGet, and we need to make tools NuGet package manager, because we need to now update our database. The console, I'll just clear that, and now the command is update database. Now you should really remember those, because you'll be using them quite a bit. Update database, and looks like we've succeeded. So let's take a look and see what we've actually produced here. Once again, if I look at solution, well, I've looked at Solution Explorer. What I'm going to do now is to look at the server, and to do that, if I go to View and then not the Server Explorer, but the SQL Server Object Explorer, and take a look at that. You'll recall in my context file that the name of the database is test. I meant to change that, but I've already got a test database, but it's just added my table, which is okay. So let's take a look at the test database. You can see many other databases I've got on the server as well, but this one is ours for the moment. I take a look at the tables. I can expand that, and there's my table there. So if I right click and choose view data, and there it is, there's my table. I guess I could enter data into there, you wish, and directly, but of course we can do that from code as well. And we can save our data. So I'll just close that table, SQL table, for the moment. So let me just summarize what we've done. We produced a console application, and we produced two files, student and DB context. The DB context represents the database itself, and the student file represents the table. So correspondingly over here we've got our test database on the server. It's got the table DB students, which has been produced corresponding to the student class. And to summarize how we actually made the conversion, we went to tools and then NuGet, and we did two things. We used the packages for the solution, and we used that to the packages to convert the database, the code, and we also went to NuGet and used the console application to produce the migration, which constructs the database, and also to update the database. Let's also take a look at the structure. We had a look at the data already, but look at the structure now. To do that, it's View Designer. Now, that's the designer. We should be able to see the SQL, so that's interesting. We've got the actual design of the database here, but we've also got our SQL. Now, it might be interesting to compare the class which created that. So let me go to our solution. Go to Solution Explorer and take a look at the class here. So let me open up my student class. So there's my student class, and there's the corresponding SQL that EntityFrameWork produced in order to produce the table, the SQL table. Now let's take a look at it in a bit of detail. We've got here the name of the table has been taken from here, so it's the student table. We've got an ID as well. Now anything which has got ID in it in the C# class, like person ID or anything with ID tacked on the end of it, will automatically produce a primary key. It's a primary key which starts off at a value of 1 and increments by 1. It won't accept, it's not allowed to have null fields, so it's required. We've also, now what about the string? The string you see has been converted to this NVCar, a particular SQL type, and which has a maximum value, I think it's about 8,000. So and then we've got the age, which has been converted to an integer. And notice that's by default not null as well. So in other words, that's required to enter it in. you could see that when you had a look at the table. If you tried to well, the age, well, you're not allowed to have a null in there, surprisingly. So if you make an addition to your table, and you notice how it gets incremented automatically, one at a time, and which is what we saw in our SQL. The corresponding SQL, let me just move that aside a bit so I can see both of those. Now the table had the auto incrementing, so the primary key, you notice that if I make another entry into here, then it will make an automatically incrementing field, which is what this says here. It starts off at 1 and it increments by 1. It's not allowed to have a null. Well, it does it automatically, so you don't get any choice, and it's an integer. But look at the it says that the age is not null. So if I do this, I put a person in here, and then I go on to the next one, it complains because it can't be a null, so that keeps an eye on. There's a way of changing that, but we'll talk about that later.